I'm going to present you a technique called volume-based modeling, which is about construction of complex structural models. It's a result of years of research and development. And I will first start to explain what we are doing, why we are doing this in the frame of exploration and production workflows. What I will demonstrate is which are the applications of structural model construction, what are the current solutions and their limitations. Then I will describe our own solution, its algorithm, and its benefits over surface-based techniques. Finally, I will present a case study demonstrating how we use this technique to build a large, complex model located offshore Australia. So, in the exploration and production workflows, we often need to build models containing properties and representing geological structures. These models are built from well data, seismic interpretation, outcrop interpretation, and other type of data, which are more fuzzy, which we could name geological knowledge. These models contain both information about the reservoir structure and information about the properties of the reservoir, properties being facies, porosity, permeability, etc. From this model, I will only talk about the structural modeling part. I will not talk about the property population part. And these structural models can be divided into, on one side, the surface models, which are composed of a set of horizon and fault surfaces and topological information about the connection between these surfaces, and a volume model, which can be a structured grid for flow simulation, for example, a boundary representation that can be used for velocity modeling, or a tetrahedral mesh used for geomechanical calculations. These volume models are traditionally used in several numerical processing algorithms, like flow simulation, for example. And the results from these numerical processings are used to take some operational decisions. So the full picture is a bit complex, but I will talk mainly about the construction of a structural model, a surface model, and I will touch upon the construction of volume models as well. And I will insist on one attribute of the construction technique. The construction technique should be robust, meaning that it should handle any type of geological complexity and that the output should not be worse than the input. So there are two main families of structural modeling approaches. The first one is called surface-based modeling, and it consists in modeling independently from each other, horizon and fault surfaces. These surfaces are then cut by each other and glued to each other in order to form a boundary representation. A boundary representation basically is a representation of geological layers and fault blocks by their outer boundaries. An example of such technique is explicit surface interpolation, such as the techniques that were usually demonstrated by the GoCAD consortium. Another technique is volume-based modeling. Volume-based modeling is conceptually different. It consists in building first a meshed representation of a volume of interest, and then cutting this volume by horizon surfaces. So it's an initial volume that is subdivided into layers. The end result of this technique is a meshed volume that contains a volume mesh. Example of this technique is pillar grading. In pillar grading, what you traditionally do is that you are extruding grid pillars from a 2D grid, and that's your volume mesh, and then you're slicing these pillars by horizon surfaces to produce the final structural model. Both these techniques are facing some challenges. And these challenges are related to complex geological environments, complex structurally and also complex stratigraphically. The first type of challenge is the handling of complex fault systems, Y faults, X faults, lambda faults, because these faults will impact the topology of the horizon surfaces. The horizons located at the bottom of the reservoir will have a topology that is different from the ones located at the top of the reservoir. And that's a problem for both surface and volume-based techniques, as I presented in the previous slide. The second type of structural complexity is the handling of multi-Z surfaces such as salt bodies and thrust faults. And the third type of complexity that I will cite is the handling of thin layers and multiple unconformities or low-angle unconformities. Let's go back now to the surface-based modeling techniques. The way surface-based modeling techniques work, in general, is by modeling horizon surfaces independently from each other, or when there is a dependency, the dependency is expressed in the form of an isopack or an isocore map. Then these horizon surfaces are extended towards the faults or cut by the faults in order to remove the pieces that would not fit into boundary representation. And then the boundary representation can be built and the regions can be identified. When all these subvolumes have been properly identified, they are used to create typically reservoir grids. That's called a surface-based representation because what is modeled is really the interfaces between the layers and not the layers themselves. So we model horizons. Sometimes it doesn't go so well, and there are some numerical issues when trying to seal this surface model, to glue this surface model. In this case, we obtain what we call a leaking volume model, meaning that all the zones of the model cannot be identified properly, and we cannot build a reservoir grid based on this kind of representation. What we are proposing is a volume-based technique, which is much more sophisticated than the pillar grading approach that I presented a couple of slides ago, and that is able to handle any kind of structural complexity. This technique is very simple. What's done is to take a set of surfaces as triangulated surfaces and a set of horizon surfaces, horizon interpretations, as points. From those, we create a meshed volume model, and in this case, it's a tetrahedral mesh because it's a very flexible representation. On this tetrahedral mesh, we compute a property that we call stratigraphy that is representing the relative geological age of the layer. There are a few constraints that are used to perform this interpolation. First, ISO values of the stratigraphy property must go through the horizon interpretation points. Then we need to have an interpolation that is discontinuous across the faults but continuous everywhere else in the volume. Finally, we need to ensure the smoothness of the stratigraphy property, which means that we need to minimize the variations of depth and thicknesses of the layers. This stratigraphy property is then used to subdivide the volume into several layers, and the volume model that is built this way can be used to create a grid, which is the end product of our technique. That's a volume-based technique because we are modeling directly geological layers and not the interfaces between these layers. So just short explanation about this rainbow type of display that I've been showing. So as you can see on the right, actually it's a property that is increasing from the bottom of the model to the top of the model, as you can see on the top left of this slide, and that is represented with a periodic color scale so that we can see better the layering. So this technique seems very simple, but there are some problematic cases that need to be handled with care, and for which we developed a set of fit-for-purpose solutions. The first challenge with this method is the case of large thickness variations. Because we are using constraints that will minimize the deep and thickness variations, we can have artifacts produced when the input data shows that there are very steep variations of deep and thicknesses. And that's the case on this picture. So in order to improve the handling of this kind of situations, what we are doing is that we are removing the thickness trends. So we are computing the thickness trends before we interpolate the stratigraphy function. We remove these thickness trends from the constraints of the stratigraphic function interpolation, and we obtain the results that is shown on the right of this drawing, where there is no more artifacts. So also the construction process and algorithm is conceptually simple. There are a series of challenges that need to be addressed for this technique to work properly in any kind of geological environment. The first type of challenge is the handling of large deep and thickness variations. Because we are using constraint for smoothing the interpolation that will minimize the variation of deep and thicknesses, we can get artifacts when trying to interpolate this stratigraphy function on models that contain large deep variations, for example, in the data. And you can see that it's the case on the images shown here on the left, where we have some artifacts in the interpolation because of the thickness variations. What we are doing to fix this issue is that we are removing the thickness trends or thickness variation trends from the data. So what we are doing is that when we are setting the constraints saying that an ISO value of the stratigraphy function should go through the input horizon interpretations, we are actually taking into account the thickness trends and interpolating detrended stratigraphy function. And we are re-adding the trend at the end. It produces the results that you can see on the right, where the artifacts have been removed. Another challenge is the handling of unconformities, such as erosions, base lap, discontinuities, and the handling of fault activity. You may want to say that the fault was active before an erosive event, that it has been eroded, and that it should not appear above an erosion. So the way we are handling these situations is by modeling the conformable sequences one after each other. So first we identify conformable sequences based on the type of the horizons. Then we model one sequence after each other. And finally, we unsue the tetrahedral mesh to represent the discontinuities, the unconformities in the tetrahedral mesh as we are modeling the sequences. The third challenge that we had to address is scalability. Because we are using a tetrahedral mesh as a support for the interpolation of the stratigraphy attribute, we cannot model very finely detailed horizons using this technique, because having a much bigger or much higher resolution requires a much bigger tetrahedral mesh. So what we are doing is that we are using explicit surface modeling technique as a post-processing while getting sure that we do not introduce some intersections between the modeled surfaces. Now I will have a couple of slides comparing surface and volume-based technique. What I will do is that I will first explain how surface-based techniques are working, what are the limitations of these methods, and the improvements brought by volume-based techniques for a series of problems. And the first problem that I will address is conformal modeling. Conformal modeling is a very commonly used technique when creating structural models in the oil and gas industry, because it corresponds to the situation where you have one or several reference horizons where you have a dense interpretation, typically horizon that is based on a seismic interpretation, and some horizons, sometimes many, that are based on sparse interpretation, typically well data. In that case, what is done by surface-based technique is to compute first the thickness between both horizons, then to offset some of the points from the reference horizon using the thickness map that has been computed, and to model the second surface based on both the original points and the offset points. It works well in simple scenario, but in more complex scenarios such as this one, where you don't have any dense interpretation covering the whole area of interest, it doesn't work everywhere. So here, if we set the rule that horizon H2 should be conformable to horizon H1 and horizon H3 should be conformable to horizon H2, what we'll see is that the technique will work on the left of the model, but cannot work on the right of the model because there is no data for H1. The reason for this failure is that the conformance relationship should be symmetric. If H2 is conformable to H1, then H1 should be conformable to H2, which is not something that we can do with surface-based techniques. With volume-based techniques, it's much easier. We just have to say that all these horizons belong to the same conformable sequence and correspond to the same stratigraphy function. We'll then interpolate this stratigraphy function, and here is the result. We have one stratigraphy function that incorporates all three horizons, and that is interpolated and extrapolated in such a way that it minimizes deep and thickness variations. From this stratigraphy function, we can then compute our layering. So here is what it looks like on a real 3D model. So this is a thrust model where we have one horizon interpreted only in the north of the area of interest, an intermediate horizon that's interpreted only in the middle, and top horizon that's interpreted only in the south of the area of interest. So that's a 3D view of the same model. You can see some thrust faults that are interrupting these horizons. Here is a view of the stratigraphy function that has been computed from this model. And as you can see, the stratigraphy function honors all the input data and is properly interrupted by the fault surfaces. So we can build this kind of model without relying on isopac or isocore based technique and without any issue. It's fully automated. Here is another type of problems that's not always easy to solve using surface-based techniques. So here is a very simple model without faults, and we are trying to build intermediate layers in this model. So we have two interpreted horizons, H1 and H2, and we are trying to build intermediate layers, for example, based on single well data. What's done by surface-based technique is to compute the thickness between the two horizons, apply proportions to subdivide the thickness maps, create that way new isochore maps that can be used to model intermediate surfaces. That works well in simple scenarios, and in that case it gives a similar result than the volume-based modeling technique. In complex scenarios, however, it doesn't work so well. The reason is that it's not so easy to compute a thickness map when you have faults that have a low dip, because there are areas in the shadow of the faults where it's not possible to compute easily these thicknesses. Similarly, it's quite difficult to subdivide properly the thickness map in this situation. The volume-based modeling, instead, will work equally well in both cases because the stratigraphic function is interpolated on the whole domain. Here is a real case in 3D. So you can see here a set of fault surfaces, a couple of horizon interpretations represented by the blue dots, and we have 5 interpreted horizons. What we want to do is to create intermediate layers between these interpreted horizons. So that's performed by interpolating the stratigraphic function and extracting additional ISO values of the stratigraphic function in between the interpreted horizons. As you can see here, we have 11 intermediate horizons that have been created. So here are a few models that have been created using volume-based modeling techniques that has been presented. You can see that it can handle any kind of structural complexity, thrust faults, wide faults, flower structures. Here is a Sandbox model that was provided by the Fault Dynamics Research Group from Royal Holloway University of London. And we interpreted this model, and we were able to build a complex structural model very easily from this dataset. You can see here that this volume model can then be converted into a stair-step grid, and we can model facies and porosity on top of this grid. So here is another example of a model created using this technique. It's based on a geological cross-section from Scotland. And we have created a semi-synthetic model making some sparse horizon interpretation from this dataset. You can see that the volume-based modeling technique is able to handle this kind of sparse data very well, and we can build a seed volume model from this dataset. I will now go through a case study that is the construction of a structural model from an area located offshore Australia, from which we have a 3D seismic block, a couple of wells, and we are trying to build a structural model and a grid from this large area. The model will go from the sea bottom to the underburden. It's not a reservoir model, and it contains a lot of X, Y, and lambda faults, so that's the main structural complexity of this area. The methodology that we used was first to interpret and model the fault surfaces. So in this model we have 165 faults that have been interpreted and modeled. And then for the horizon interpretation, we built it iteratively, meaning that we did first a very sparse interpretation of the horizons. We built the first horizons, and we used the proportional layering techniques that I've explained in the previous slides to create intermediate horizons, and that helped us interpret the remaining horizons. So we have been modeling a bit, interpreting a bit, and remodeling a bit until we reached the expected result. At the end, we added the horizons that were based on well-top data, and we obtained the models that you can see at the bottom right of this slide, where we have a set of horizons and unconformities properly faulted by the faults, and that all have consistent thickness maps. All the layers have consistent thickness variations, and there is a consistent fault displacement on each fault. That's the result obtained in the form of cross-sections through a volume model. Here are the faults, the faulted horizons, and the final volume model that was then used to create a grid in the reservoir area. So in conclusion, the technique that I presented is very robust. It allows to create model in any kind of geological environment. It supports any kind of faults and fault topology, and any kind of stratigraphical relationships. It's automated, starting from fault surfaces and horizon interpretation as points. It produces silt surface model, but it also produces things that are not produced by surface-based technique, which is a stratigraphy function, which has many uses by itself. It can be used for weight correlation or for gridding, for example. And it produced as well a meshed volume, a tetrahedral mesh, that can also be used for other purposes, typically geomechanical workflows. So just a last example of model created. Here you can see a movie showing our complex thrust dataset, where you have several horizons that have been interpreted on a quite sparse mesh of 2D lines and that are color-coded. And here you can see the same horizons in intersection view. From this horizon and a set of fault surfaces, we will be creating a volume-based model. So you can see here the horizons shown one after each other. It's not so easy to distinguish because it's a highly multi-Z dataset. Here, the fault surfaces that are very complex intersections with each other, and the built horizon surfaces that are properly intersected by these faults. We could verify that everywhere in the model we have a consistent stratigraphic column. We are never putting in contact two geological layers that should not be in contact in this model. So the final model fits very well the input data, is properly faulted by the faults, and is consistent everywhere, which is very difficult to obtain on this kind of geological structure. You will now see that's again the horizon surfaces, and I will show the volumes that were built from this model. That's another quite difficult challenge, building the volume representation from the surfaces. And you can see here that the volume is perfectly sealed, and you can visualize the layers independently from each other. So that's typically the kind of results that we are able to produce with our methodology. Here are a few cross-sections of the same.